One of the big areas that we often talk about in the space of, ED&I is this notion of inclusive leadership. And even though lots of people talk about it, I think it's really important to say, well, what does that stuff mean? What are the principles or the traits of inclusive leaders? How do inclusive leaders think and how do they act? So there's lots of traits that we can talk about, and we at FAIR have mapped out some of the core kind of traits and capabilities of inclusive leaders. But I think there's a couple of ones that I really want to pull out actually. The first one is this notion of awareness. As a leader, are you aware of your own styles? Are you aware of the things that motivate you? Are you aware of your own biases? Are you aware in terms of your frames of reference and how you see the world? And more importantly, are you aware of how your leadership style impacts those people around you? The second thing about awareness is it's a two-way street. So are you aware of how other people around you, how do they experience life? Are you aware of the sort of, the practical challenges that they face? So the first principle is, if we are not aware of ourselves, but if we're not aware of the experiences, the challenges that our diverse colleagues face, it's going to make it very difficult for us to really kind of have proper engagement and to, treat people in a way which is inclusive and the rest of it. So awareness is the first call out. The second call out is this idea of curiosity. And there's been a lot of research around the kind of psychology of curiosity. But what we know for sure is that leaders that are curious, which is, are you interested in other people, demonstrate certain behaviors. And those behaviors are actually relatively straightforward. So they're, hey, how's your day? How was your weekend? What's going on for you? And curiosity is interesting because curiosity is a means to something else. So if you're curious, you get stuff back. How was your day? How was your weekend? So that facilitation of conversation starts to build your knowledge of the experiences of colleagues around you. So we have this thing where we say that curiosity leads to insight. You get insight from the conversation. That builds your knowledge, that builds your cultural competencies, and that can facilitate in terms of behavior. So curiosity is a big thing, actually. The third area, I think, around inclusive leadership, and most leaders are absolutely shocking and terrible. They can't do this, but psychologists talk about this notion of what's called perspective taking. And perspective taking is a real human and leadership skill. And perspective taking simply means this: can you see validity in a viewpoint that you fundamentally disagree with? And that's interesting because most of us find that really problematic. We can't see any validity in something that we fundamentally disagree with. And I think if you think about the world we're in today, things like Brexit, things like politics, there's lots of identity politics that flow around. So I may fundamentally disagree with you, and I may fundamentally disagree with your viewpoint on a topic. But if I can see, actually, I see where you're coming from and I see validity in what you're saying, that's a skill around perspective taking. So you can navigate around that. But most leaders are kind of more are closed off to that, actually, and stuff like that. So there's some of the kind of key things that inclusive leaders do. And the final thing that I would say around inclusive leadership is, inclusive leadership is a concept of doing stuff. And what I mean by that is, it's not good enough just to have insight, curiosity, perspective taking. As a leader, you need to make sure that you become an advocate and an ally for colleagues around you. So your job as a leader is to ask questions around who's getting the stretch projects, who's getting on those kind of, global mobility programs, etc. Am I making sure that I'm the advocate of somebody who doesn't have that power to speak up in the room? So we need to move away from inclusive leadership as just being about awareness and traits to an inclusive leader that steps in and does something and uses their privilege and power on behalf of colleagues that don't have that privilege and power within their own organizations. We also know that inclusive leadership is, it's not some mystical thing. It's actually a set of skills that all leaders can develop. So if we think it's a skill set, how do leaders develop those skills? And what we know from psychology is we all have biases. We know that for sure. Human beings have a neurological gravitational pull to people like them. We know that for sure. So one of the first skill sets of being an inclusive leader is to think about, how do you connect with people that are different from you? So you can do that in very simple ways, actually. So one is, most corporate organizations will have, affinity groups, ERGs, BRGs, and the rest of it. And my advice to leaders often is just go along, when it's International Women's Day, when it's Black History Month, when it's Pride Month, go along, sit in, listen to the conversation, soak up the kind of vibe around you. And the skill of an inclusive leader is about thinking, well, what is it that I'm hearing that I'm not normally exposed to? And what is this conversation telling me? And I think that's a skill, because actually what we need to do as leaders is to first of all let go of this sort of psychological concept that leaders know everything already. And what we need to do is to learn into the vulnerability that there's lots of stuff that we don't know about. So just having basic conversations with people and asking them questions around their life experiences. How do they experience gender bias? How do they experience racism? How do they experience homophobia? That basic level of question can help to build our awareness, and then that starts to give us the insight, which then gives us the tools to lean into some of the things that we need to do around allyship, sponsorship, and the rest of it.